It was late October of 1978, the kind of afternoon where the air feels thick enough to chew, and the Henderson County Equipment Auction sat under a dull gray sky that hadn't decided whether it wanted to rain or just hang there and judge us. The place smelled like dust, burnt coffee, and old diesel, a smell you only get when too many machines have lived too many lives in one place. I stood near the back, leaning against the dented fender of my Ford F-50, watching men pace the rows like nervous cattle, boots scuffed gravel, hands jammed into jacket pockets, eyes locked on iron the way gamblers stare at cards they think might finally save them. Land prices had doubled in 5 years, corn was high, and the banks were acting like money was something that spoiled if you didn't use it fast enough. You could feel it in the way people talked, louder than usual, quicker to laugh, quicker to brag. Nobody wanted to be the one who hesitated, not when everyone else seemed to be moving forward. My name is Jedediah Stone, and I wasn't there for a spectacle. I was there for a chisel plow, a solid 24-footer that my old International couldn't quite handle anymore. But my big tractor could, and I'd already decided what it was worth before I left the farm that morning. I'd learned a long time ago that if you don't decide the price before the bidding starts, someone else will decide it for you. The auctioneer, Bill Sampson, had a voice like gravel in a tin can and a way of talking that made you feel like standing still. Was a mistake. He was working the crowd hard over a slightly used International 1486, paint still glossy, tires barely scuffed, the kind of tractor that made men straighten their backs just looking at it. The bids climbed fast, and when the hammer finally fell, the price was higher than it had sold for new 2 years earlier. The young man who bought it grinned like he'd just won something, and maybe he thought he had. He didn't see the note he'd just signed stretching out ahead of him like a long winter road, with no lights. Most of us didn't. That was the mood back then. Then I saw Rich Davies moving through the crowd, and the noise around him seemed to bend, like people were unconsciously making room. Rich didn't walk so much as he paraded. Clean Carhartts without a grease stain in sight, seed corn cap perched just right, hair combed neat like he might be late for a meeting in town instead of standing in a muddy lot. Everyone called him Rich, partly because it was his name and partly because it fit. He was flanked by his 2 sons, already wearing that same easy confidence, that same belief that the world would continue to make room for them as long as they kept moving. Rich was the picture of what farming was becoming, at least on paper. He clapped the young buyer on the back and said loud enough for half the county to hear that you couldn't make money with old junk, that you had to spend money to make money. His eyes flicked toward me for just a second, a smirk tugging at his mouth, like he already knew which side of that sentence I was standing on. I didn't say anything. I never did with Rich. I just nodded once and went back to watching the iron. My business was my business. I farmed a section and a half of black dirt my grandfather had broken with mules. Land my father had paid off inch by inch, and by 1978 every acre, every machine, every bolt in my shop was paid for. That made me an oddity, something people talked about in the same tone they used for old barns that refused to fall down. The chisel plow finally came up, solid frame, straight shanks, honest wear, the kind of tool that didn't care about fashion. I let the tire kickers have their fun until the price slid into reason, then raised my hand at $3,000. The bidding stalled, just for a breath, and I felt that familiar quiet settle in my chest, the feeling that comes when something makes sense. Bill called for $3,100, then $35, and that was when Rich's voice cut in, smooth and smug, like he was ordering lunch instead of bidding on iron. He hadn't even looked at the plow. He was looking at me. I held his gaze for a moment, long enough to make it clear I understood what this was really about. This wasn't about steel. It was about 2 ways of living standing 10 feet apart in a dusty lot. Rich had been buying land all around me, stacking notes on top of notes. His machine shed filling with brand new green and red iron, all of it shining, all of it owned by someone else. I shook my head at Bill, not because I couldn't afford the extra $500, but because the plow wasn't worth it. Not to a man who knew what value felt like in his hands. Rich laughed, loud and sharp, and told his boys that I thought too small, that you had to keep pushing or you'd get left behind. As he walked past me, He nodded toward my place and asked if I was still running that old white monster. Surprised the scrap man hadn't hauled it off yet. He meant my big bud, an HN320 I'd bought with 3 years of saved profit, cash on the barrel. It wasn't pretty. The paint was faded, rust blooming where branches had kissed the cab. But under that hood sat a Cummins NTA 855, and when it ran it sounded like the earth itself clearing its throat. It was simple, brutally strong, and it was mine. I told him it still ran. He said for now, and walked away. I watched him go, that slow burn starting low in my gut. Not because of the insult, but because of the blindness. He wasn't alone in it. Most of them weren't. They were drunk on cheap credit and Goodyears, convinced the music would never stop. To them, my paid-for equipment and quiet books looked like fear. They didn't understand that a man who sleeps without owing anyone is already rich, even if nobody claps for him. The thing is, I didn't feel brave standing there. I felt out of step. Driving home that evening, past fields where fence lines were coming out to make room for bigger machines, I wondered if maybe I was the one missing something. Corn was strong. Land was climbing. Every banker in town had a smile and a pen ready. Even at home, the talk wasn't immune. My wife listened more than she spoke, but I could see the questions in her eyes when neighbors talked about new houses on hills and vacations they'd never taken before. My boys heard it at school, heard it from Rich's sons, from teachers who talked about efficiency and growth like they were commandments. That night, after supper, I sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open, numbers neat and calm, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of doubt. Not panic, just a quiet, persistent thought that maybe the world had shifted and I was standing still out of stubbornness instead of wisdom. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches against the house, and somewhere down the road I could hear a truck hauling new iron home, the low hum fading into the dark. I closed the ledger, turned off the light, and lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of a place that was paid for, telling myself that tomorrow I'd hitch the big bud to the cultivator and do what I'd always done, even as the question lingered, unanswered, in the quiet. What if the rest of them were right? And what if I was the one about to be left behind? I went back to work the next morning like I always did, because on a farm you don't get to sit around and think yourself into a corner. The day shows up whether you're ready or not. The sun came up pale and cold, turning the low spots in the fields into a thin silver shine. And the first thing I did was walk out to the machine shed and put my hand on the big bud's hood, the way you might touch a horse before you saddle it. Not because it needs the affection, but because you need the contact. The shed was older than I was, built by my father when a man still believed that if you framed it heavy enough, it would last a lifetime. The bud sat there with its white paint dulled by years and its cab corner scarred, where a tree branch had once slid down it in a tight turn. It wasn't a showpiece. It was a tool. I climbed the steps, settled into the seat that had molded itself to my shape, and turned the key. The Cummins caught with that deep, steady bark, a sound that didn't ask permission, and as it warmed I watched the gauges like I always did. Not because I expected trouble, but because I'd learned you don't ignore small warnings, and then act surprised when they turn into big ones. I pulled out of the yard before the coffee finished cooling in my gut, hooked to my cultivator, and headed into the field. And for a while, everything felt simple again. Dirt rolled, steel held, the engine lugged like it was born for it. Whatever Rich Davies and his boys were doing up the road in their shiny parade of iron, I was doing what I knew how to do, and there was comfort in that. But comfort can be a liar. The boom years have a way of making you think your routine is proof you're safe, when really it's just proof you haven't been tested yet. The testing started quietly, not with a bank notice or a newspaper headline, but with little human moments that got under my skin. At the co-op, men stopped talking when I walked in, and then started again a second later, pretending they hadn't. At the diner, the coffee tasted the same, but the conversations had changed. Everything was about acreage and upgrades, and how so-and-so was leveraging equity like that was a skill you learned with a wrench. Rich would sit near the window, holding court, and if you listened, you could hear him teaching younger fellows how to talk to bankers, how to make a loan sound like a smart decision instead of a gamble. He didn't say my name much, but he didn't have to. Every time someone joked about old equipment, every time someone mentioned downtime and warranty and dealer service, I could feel the joke sliding in my direction. I carried my seed and my parts and my quiet like a man carrying firewood through a room full of men who just bought propane. Even at church, you could see it. The women would talk about new kitchens and new cars in a soft voice that pretended it was just sharing, and my wife would smile politely and keep her hands folded. But at home the questions would come out sideways. Not accusations, never that, but questions that landed heavy because they were honest. What if we bought the Henderson quarter if it came up? What if we upgraded the combine before the old one got too tired? What if the boys needed more land to come back to someday? She wasn't chasing status. She was thinking about our sons and their futures, and that's what made it hard, because it meant I couldn't dismiss it as vanity. I'd lie in bed some nights listening to coyotes yip in the distance, and I'd feel like I was standing on a riverbank watching everyone else wade across, convinced the water was shallow, while I stayed back because I could see the current. But seeing the current doesn't stop you from wondering whether you're just afraid of getting wet. My boys felt it too. Michael was 16 then, old enough to carry real weight, young enough to believe the world rewards the bold every time. He'd come home from school and talk about Rich's new machines the way kids talk about a fast car. His sons had three-wheelers, new trucks, things that didn't come from sweat so much as signatures. One night at supper he asked me straight out why we didn't get a new tractor, why we didn't have what the Davies had. The room went quiet, forks pausing midair, and for a second I saw the question behind the question. It wasn't only about iron, it was about whether his father was falling behind, whether our family was quietly losing while everyone else was winning in public. I set my fork down and told him something I'd never learned in a classroom. The Davies don't own those tractors, the bank does. Rich has to sell his first 10,000 bushels of corn every year just to feed the interest, before he buys a bag of seed or pays an electric bill. We don't. Everything we sell after costs is ours. That tractor out there, this house, this land, it's ours. There's a difference. He nodded like he understood, but I could see it in his eyes, the doubt still there. The way a teenager's mind takes facts and measures them against what he sees with his own two eyes. And what he saw was Rich's big brick house on the hill and our old shed with peeling paint. What he saw was Rich's wife in a Lincoln and my wife in a station wagon. What he saw was a world cheering for the man who borrowed and looking through the man who didn't. I didn't blame him. I just felt the weight of time. The slow kind of weight that doesn't crush you all at once, but makes your shoulders ache by nightfall. That spring, the bud gave me my first reminder that paid for doesn't mean perfect. I was working a field that had been fall plowed, the soil turning like dark cake under the cultivator. The engine was loping easy, turbo singing its small, steady note, when I heard a thin, high-pitched whine rise up from under the cab. It wasn't loud at first. It was the kind of sound you can ignore if you want to be careless. Then came a shudder I felt through the seat, and the steering went heavy like the front end had suddenly decided it didn't want to listen to me anymore. At the same time, the cultivator arms, held up by hydraulics, began to sag. My stomach dropped before my brain finished naming the problem. I pushed in the clutch, throttled down, and listened as the whine turned into a sick grinding. Metal on metal, something eating itself. I climbed down, and the quiet of the field hit me hard, because the bud's roar had become a kind of company over the years, and without it the world feels to open. Under the belly of the tractor, hydraulic fluid dripped in a thin, steady stream, shimmering in the sunlight. It looked like blood, and I remember thinking, stupidly, that I hated that Rich would probably drive by and see it. It wasn't a job you fix with baling wire. The main pump on a tractor that size controls everything. Without it, you don't have steering, brakes, remotes, nothing. You have 30,000 pounds of dead weight sitting right where you don't want it. I started walking back to the shop, 2 miles, boots sinking into soft spots, dust sticking to sweat, my mind running numbers and steps. Halfway home I heard a pickup behind me, and I didn't have to turn around to know whose it was. Rich slowed, rolled down his window, and leaned out like he was doing me a favor by noticing. He looked past me at the bud sitting silent in the field. "Having trouble, Jed?" he called, and that old smirk was back. I told him it was just taking a break. He laughed and said if I needed a real tractor to finish up, he could have one of his Deeres over in an hour, and of course he'd have to charge a fair rate. I said I'd manage and kept walking without looking back, because if I'd looked back I might have said something that would have felt good in the moment and tasted sour for years. His laughter followed me down the road until the wind took it away. In my shop, I pulled out the manuals, thick as phone books, pages already stained with my own fingerprints. I wasn't afraid of work, but I was afraid of waiting. Waiting is what kills you in planting season. You can do everything right and still lose a week to weather, so you don't get to waste days on things you could have prevented. I drained 50 gallons of hydraulic fluid into clean barrels because fluid is money when you're not careless. I rigged chains and an engine hoist, supported the driveline, crawled under that massive frame on a creeper, drop light swinging slightly every time I shifted my weight. Bolts fought me, thumb-thick bolts caked in grime, and by the end of the first day my hands were raw and my knuckles split, blood mixing with oil in a way that makes you stop noticing after a while. When the pump finally came free, it was heavy enough that I felt it in my lower back for days, and when I opened it up I found what I expected and still hated. A small bearing had failed and chewed everything else like a dog with a bone, scoring pistons, warping the swash plate, turning precision into scrap. I called the nearest big bud dealer, all the way in Minnesota, from the party line phone in the kitchen while my wife shushed the kids, so I could hear over the crackle. The parts man was polite, and his voice carried that dealer calm that never has to worry about harvest. He told me a new pump assembly would be over for $1,000. For $1,000. The number landed on me like a sack of feed. I could buy a decent used Farmall for that. I asked if there was any other way, and after a pause he said the pump itself was a standard Eaton, and if I could get the model number off the housing, I might be able to find a rebuild kit from a hydraulic supply house. Cheaper, he warned, but I'd have to do it myself, and it was precision work. Precision work didn't scare me. Paying for $1,000 for something that could be fixed with $400 did. I scrubbed grease off the housing with brake cleaner and a wire brush until I found the tag, then read the numbers to a man in Des Moines whose voice sounded like he'd been selling seals since the beginning of time. He said yep, he had a kit, gaskets, seals, bearings, piston set, the works, for $120 plus shipping. Relief hit me so hard I had to sit on an overturned bucket. The parts came 2 days later. I cleaned every component until it looked like it belonged on an operating table. I laid everything out in order, measured tolerances with a micrometer, lubricated O-rings with fresh fluid, torqued bolts to spec, slow and steady. Because rushing precision is how you create a second problem while fixing the first. My boys came out and watched. I could tell they were impressed, but I could also tell they were confused, because their friends' fathers called the dealer and wrote a check, and then complained about the bill like it was a weather report. I worked until my shoulders ached, hands cramped, and by the third day I had the rebuilt pump back in place, fluid filtered and poured, lines bled, everything tight. I climbed into the cab and turned the key. The Cummins coughed, belched a puff of black smoke, then settled into its familiar idle. I stared at the hydraulic pressure gauge like my life depended on it. For one long heartbeat it didn't move. Then the needle began to climb, slow and steady into the green. I moved the lever and the cultivator arms rose smooth and strong. I put it in gear and finished the field with the kind of quiet satisfaction you don't get from anything that arrives on a trailer with a bow on it. The whole ordeal cost me 3 days of downtime and about $450 in parts and shipping. But the community didn't see the money I saved. They saw the 3 days the bud sat dead in a field, and that's what people remember. At the co-op, the talk wasn't about a rebuild kit or knowing your machine. It was about how Jed Stone's old junk broke down again. Rich held court by the coffee machine, talking about warranty and service calls, about how you can't afford downtime in this business, and men nodded like he was preaching. I stood there with grease still in the lines of my hands and felt like I was watching a play, where everyone had agreed on the script except me. Then, like the world wanted to lean into the joke, I got called into the bank a few weeks later when I went in to make a deposit. The president, Bill Harrison, was a nervous man who always fidgeted with his tie like it was choking him. His father had given my father his first loan, back when loans were made between men who knew each other's fields. He offered me a seat and told me my accounts were strong, very strong. And then he leaned forward with that careful smile bankers use when they're about to tell you something they believe is for your own good. He said the board looked at my operation and saw untapped potential. My debt-to-asset ratio was basically zero. I had hundreds of thousands in equity just sitting there. I could expand, buy the Henderson quarter coming up for sale, upgrade my equipment line. He could put together a financing package that would make it all easy. He talked the way Rich talked, like caution was an outdated habit and growth was a duty. I told him I was happy where I was. He sighed and said times had changed. Inflation was running. Money in savings was losing value every day. The smart play was to convert cash into hard assets, land, iron, because they weren't making any more of it. For a moment, I felt that old flicker of doubt turn into something sharper. Not fear, exactly. More like the uncomfortable realization that the world can make an argument sound logical, even when the end of it is a trap. I looked out his office window across the town square, and I saw Rich Davies getting into his Lincoln. And for the first time, he didn't look relaxed. His shoulders were tight, movements quick, like a man late to something important. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just a bad day. But it stuck with me. I thanked Bill for the advice and told him I'd sleep on it. And when I stepped outside the bank, the air felt colder than it should have. A chill that didn't come from weather. Driving home, the radio murmured in the background, and a name came through the static that I'd heard before, but never really listened to. Paul Volcker, the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, talking in that dry, careful way men talk when they're about to make other people suffer for a principle. He used phrases like monetary restraint and painful, but necessary adjustments. Most folks would have turned the volume down. I turned it up. I didn't understand all of it, but I understood the tone. The way his words carried the kind of certainty that doesn't ask permission from people like us. That night, a letter came in the mail from the company that financed the only debt my family had, the loan on my wife's station wagon. We'd assumed it was fixed. The letter was full of legal language, the kind that makes you feel stupid on purpose. But one line stood out clean as a fence post. The lender reserved the right to adjust the interest rate in accordance with prevailing market conditions. Our rate would climb from 9% to 12%. It wasn't a catastrophe, not for us. But when I held that letter in my hand, I felt the first tremor, the small shift underfoot that tells you the ground is about to move. And I thought of Rich and his stacked notes and his shiny machines. And for the first time, I didn't feel angry at him. I felt something closer to dread. The kind you feel when you see a storm line on the horizon and realize the people out ahead of you don't even know they're standing in its path. By the time the spring of 1981 arrived, the world felt like it was holding its breath. Not in the dramatic way storms announce themselves, but in that quieter, more dangerous way where everything looks normal right up until it isn't. The winter had been thin on snow, the kind that leaves the ground naked too early. And when planting season came, the soil didn't have the weight to it that it should have. It broke apart too easily in my hands, dusty instead of rich, and the wind carried more grit than promise. Still, habit is a powerful thing. And most mornings, I climbed into the big bud and went to work as if routine alone could keep the edges from fraying. The radio had become a constant companion, not for music but for news. And what I heard never quite lined up with what I saw in town. Men were still buying, still talking big, still making plans that assumed tomorrow would look like yesterday. But the voices on the air talked about tightening and restraint, about inflation like it was a fire that needed oxygen cut off, no matter who got burned in the process. Corn went in the ground, but it came up uneven, pale where it should have been deep green. By June, leaves curled in on themselves by midday, a quiet prayer for rain that didn't come. You could stand at the edge of a field and hear it crackle under your boots, the sound of soil giving up. At the co-op, the morning chatter thinned. Men leaned against pallets of seed and stared out the open door at a sky bleached almost white. And nobody joked about yields anymore. The price board began to change, not all at once, just enough to make you check it twice. Corn slid from 350 to 3, then to 80, and every dime felt like a small betrayal. For a man leveraged to the hilt, a dime wasn't a number. It was a choice between paying interest or paying someone who worked for you. I saw it in Rich before I heard it. The swagger drained out of him first, replaced by a kind of restless motion, like he couldn't stand still long enough for the math to catch him. His wife traded the Lincoln for a more sensible Ford without explanation, and one of his hired men quietly disappeared from the rotation. His pickup no longer parked by the shop in the mornings. People said Rich was just getting more efficient. Nobody believed it. One afternoon, I ran into him at the parts store, and he looked like a man who hadn't slept well in weeks. One of his big John Deere 8850s was down, not with something you could hear or feel, but with something blinking on a dash. The transmission wouldn't come out of park, lights flashing like a small accusation. He talked fast, hands moving as he explained what he'd checked: fluid, fuses, all the simple things. The parts man shook his head and said it sounded like a solenoid pack or a control module, something that needed a dealer tech and a diagnostic kit. 70 miles away. 2 weeks out. Rich swore under his breath, the sound tight and angry. And for the first time I saw him the way a system sees you when you stop being an asset and start being a liability. Every day that tractor sat was a day interest accrued whether it worked or not. I went back to my fields and pulled out an old V-Ripper, a brutal tool meant to break hardpan, and ran it deep between the rows to help what little moisture there was find a way down. It was slow, heavy work, the bud grunting under the load, turbo screaming. But it did what it had always done. There were no sensors to argue with me, no lights to blink, just steel and pressure and a man paying attention. In town, the conversations shifted again. The men who'd once talked about expansion now talked about cash flow in lowered voices. The bank parking lot filled earlier in the mornings. Pickups lined up like a quiet confession. One night the phone rang late, and when I picked it up it was a neighbor. His voice thick with embarrassment, asking if I could spare a few hundred to make a payment, just to buy him a month. My wife and I talked it over and said yes, quietly, without asking for details, because pride is a fragile thing when times turn. We weren't rich, not the way Rich had been on paper, but we had money sitting where everyone had told us it shouldn't be, earning almost nothing and doing exactly what it was meant to do. Letters started arriving more frequently, not just ours but everyone's. Thin white envelopes that carried small changes in language that added up to something bigger. Rates adjusted, terms revisited, clauses noticed for the first time. At the elevator, I watched men run numbers on scrap paper and shake their heads, then shake them again like maybe the second time would change something. Winter came early that year, sharp and dry, and when it settled in it brought a silence I hadn't heard before. There was no talk of new equipment, no plans laid out over coffee, just survival, measured in months instead of seasons. Rich held on longer than most, because size buys you time even when it's borrowed. But it also means you have farther to fall. He sold one of the 8850s at a loss that made men whistle low when they heard it, just to raise operating capital. Grain trucks went next. He stopped talking about the future and started talking about the next week. When I saw him at the elevator in the fall of '83, waiting to unload corn priced just over $2, he looked 10 years older than he had at that auction 5 years earlier. His clothes were worn. His hands, once soft with management, were calloused and stained. He didn't look at anyone until I said his name. He flinched, then gave a bitter laugh when I said it had been a tough year. The bank had called his main note. He said, 90 days to restructure. We both knew what that meant. There was no satisfaction in hearing it, no sense of being proven right. Just a heavy sadness, because when a man like Rich falls, he takes a piece of the whole community with him. He said something then that stayed with me. Something about debt being a wolf you keep on a leash until the day it gets hungry enough to eat you. And when he looked up, his eyes were clear in a way they'd never been before. I watched him walk away, shoulders bent, and I understood then that the storm I'd heard on the radio years earlier had finally arrived, not with thunder, but with the slow, grinding sound of things that had been stretched afar finally tearing. The winter that followed didn't announce itself with a blizzard or a headline. It just settled in and refused to leave, a gray weight pressing down on everything. By January of '80, the roads were quiet in a way that felt wrong. Fewer trucks, fewer reasons to be out. Men stayed home because being seen driving around town without a purpose had started to feel like a confession. The radio kept talking about rates and restraint and necessary pain. And every time I heard it, I thought about how easy it is to make pain sound tidy when you're not the one carrying it. The calls kept coming, late at night, voices low, asking for time, for help, for a loan small enough to pretend it didn't matter and big enough to matter a lot. We helped where we could, not because we were saints, but because we could see ourselves in every one of them. Money is different when it's a buffer instead of a trophy. It doesn't make you feel powerful. It makes you feel responsible. Rich fought longer than anyone expected. He sold land first, then machines, each sale cutting away another piece of the man he'd been when the world applauded him. The big brick house on the hill went quiet, lights off in rooms that had once been full of noise. His sons stopped showing up at school in new trucks and started showing up early to work instead. When foreclosure finally came, it didn't come with drama. It came with paper stapled to telephone poles and a date set for a Saturday in April. Public auction, assets to be sold to the highest bidder. The words looked cheap printed on colored paper, but they carried a finality that no one could argue with. The day of the auction dawned cold and gray, the wind snapping at the flags on the auctioneer's truck like it was impatient to get it over with. The whole county showed up, not because they wanted to buy, but because they needed to see it. The way people attend funerals for reasons they can't quite explain. The machinery was lined up in neat rows in Rich's yard, the same yard where he'd once hosted parties and shown off purchases like they were medals. The John Deeres, the Steiger, the grain trucks, all of it looked different now. Less like symbols and more like relics, dinosaurs waiting for extinction. Mud clung to tires from the last desperate harvest, and the shine that had once blinded people now just reflected the overcast sky. Rich stood off to the side with his wife and sons, and I almost didn't recognize him. The confidence was gone, burned away, leaving behind a man who looked smaller without actually being smaller. His wife wept quietly into a handkerchief, and his boys stared at the ground like it might open and swallow them. The banker was there too, stiff in his city suit, eyes darting, directing things without looking anyone in the face. I stood near the back, leaning against my old Ford, in the same place I'd stood years before when everything still felt possible. The auctioneer's voice sounded hollow as he started with the small items. Tools and tanks and tires going cheap because nobody had cash and nobody wanted reminders. When they moved to the big machines, the bids came slow and thin. The Steiger, once the pride of the county, sold for a fraction of what Rich had paid, hauled away by a corporate outfit from out of state that didn't know its history and didn't care. Each fall of the gavel felt like a nail driven into something that had once been alive. When they got to the planter, a John Deere 7000, 16 rows, well-maintained. Something a man actually needs if he's going to put a crop in the ground. The bidding stalled at 8,000. Rich stiffened, hope flaring for just a second, then fading when no one spoke. I looked at him and saw it then, the last thin thread holding him upright. In that moment, with the wind cutting through my jacket and the crowd holding its breath, I understood that this wasn't about being right. It was about what kind of man I wanted to be when I had the chance to be something else. I raised my hand and said 10,000. The sound of my voice carried farther than I expected in the quiet, and heads turned. The banker looked relieved. Rich looked confused, then shocked. Then something like pain crossed his face so fast it was gone before he could stop it. The auctioneer jumped on it, called for more, found none, and dropped the hammer. I walked up, wrote a check from an account everyone had told me was foolish to keep, and took the bill of sale. Then I walked back to Rich. He wouldn't look at me at first. I told him I didn't need another planter, that mine worked fine, and that I wanted him to keep this one, right where it was. He shook his head, said he couldn't pay me, that he had nothing left. I told him I wasn't asking him to. $1 a year lease would make it legal. That was it. A man needs tools to work, and neighbors help neighbors, whether it's horses in a depression or iron in a crisis. He stared at me for a long moment, throat working, then nodded once, sharp and final. like a man accepting the truth of something he'd fought too long. Later that afternoon, after most of the crowd had drifted away, the bank auctioned the land. The home quarter went first, then the one that bordered my north field. The one Rich had bought at the top. The bidding was weak. I bought it for $700 an acre, cash. It felt less like a victory and more like a responsibility settling onto my shoulders. The next morning I drove into town and found Rich standing in the driveway of the small house. He was renting, staring at nothing. I told him what I'd done and what I needed. A good man to farm that quarter. I'd provide the land, the inputs. He'd provide the labor and the planter. We'd split the profit down the middle. He looked at me like I'd offered him something fragile and rare, something he was afraid to break by touching. He asked why. I told him it wasn't just about him, that it could have been any of us, and that the land doesn't care who holds the deed, only who tends it. He smiled then, not the old smile, but a quieter one. And for the first time since the music stopped, I saw a man begin to stand back up. The years that followed didn't come with any clean lines or easy endings, just a slow settling, like dust after a long drive down a gravel road. Rich and I farmed that north quarter together, and he worked his own 80 that the bank couldn't touch. The land his father had left him in his wife's name, without ever knowing how important that small legal detail would become. There were no grand conversations about partnership or redemption. We talked about weather, about seed depth, about whether the price board in town was worth looking at that day or better ignored. In the mornings, I'd see his truck already parked by the field when I arrived, his shoulders bent into the work the way they hadn't been when he was managing from a distance. He never complained, not once. He just worked, sunup to sundown, like a man rebuilding something he'd almost lost the right to touch. The community changed too, though nobody announced it. The flash of the 70s was gone. Men stopped talking about expansion and started talking about repairs. Old machinery got dragged out of sheds and coaxed back to life. You heard more talk about cash flow than land speculation, more about making do than getting bigger. The diner was quieter, but the conversations that did happen felt heavier, more honest. People looked each other in the eye again. The ones who'd survived didn't brag about it, because survival stopped feeling like an achievement and started feeling like a shared condition. My wife carried herself differently, lighter somehow, no longer measuring our life against anyone else's. The station wagon kept running. The house stayed the same. We didn't win anything, and we didn't lose what mattered. Michael went off to agricultural college later in the decade, full of new ideas about soil science and genetics and systems thinking, things I listened to carefully even when I didn't fully understand them, because I'd learned that dismissing the next generation is just another way of going blind. When he came home in '89, he brought books and opinions and questions, and one evening we stood together in the shop changing oil on the Big Bud. 14 years old now, paint almost completely gone from the hood, dents and scars telling a story you could trace with your fingers. The Cummins still fired on the first try, that deep familiar sound filling the space like a memory that hadn't faded. He told me about a paper he'd written on the farm crisis, about debt-to-asset ratios and leverage, about how his professor said his main case study, an anonymous farmer who refused to take on debt and survived, was an outlier, not a scalable model for modern agriculture. I laughed then, a low sound that surprised even me, because there was truth in that and comfort too. I told him it wasn't a model for getting big. It was a model for staying. He nodded slowly, pouring fresh oil through the funnel, careful not to spill, and said he finally understood what I'd been trying to teach him all those years ago, that it had never been about being poor or afraid, but about being free. I looked around the shop at the tools we owned outright, at the tractor that had earned its keep a dozen times over, and then out through the open door to the fields stretching away under a late summer sky, and I felt something settle in me that hadn't fully settled before. Not pride, not relief, something quieter, acceptance, maybe. The understanding that the land remembers hands, not balance sheets, and that a good night's sleep is worth more than applause you can't cash when the music stops. Later, when we shut the lights off and locked up, the Bud's engine ticking as it cooled, I thought back to that auction in '78, to the dust and the noise and the certainty everyone carried like a badge. I thought about how close I'd come to doubting myself, not because I was wrong, but because I was alone in being right. And I understood then that the lesson wasn't about tractors or interest rates or even farming. It was about choosing a way of living you can carry when the world stops agreeing with you, and about what you do when you find yourself standing while someone else has fallen. The engine's deep rumble when we fired it up one last time that evening echoed out across the quiet fields, steady and unremarkable and strong. And in that sound I heard not victory, but continuity, the simple, stubborn rhythm of a life built to last, one paid for day at a time.